We were looking at how do we calculate real GDP, nominal GDP, and GDP deflator. In part one, we looked at how we can find real GDP, nominal GDP for 1995 and 1996 for this small closed economy which had three goods. Now I wanted to find, having found nominal and real GDP, we can find the GDP deflator now. So for GDP deflator, now here we need to recall what GDP deflator is. So recall that GDP deflator at time at year t is just the nominal GDP at year t divided by real GDP at year t. And obviously, this calculation we're going to do for specific base year because the choice of base year will influence what real GDP is going to be. So this is how do we calculate real GDP in real t, and we want to find this real GDP using 1990. Sorry, how this is how we calculate the GDP deflator, and we want to find this GDP deflator using 1995 as the base year, right? So using 1990, here the base year matters because GDP deflator depends upon real GDP, and the value of real GDP depends upon base year because real GDP is calculated using base year prices. Using 1995 as a base year. So if I use 1995 as a base year, so then we can see what calculations, what values we get for the GDP deflator. So now let's first find GDP deflator for 1995. That is just 100. GDP deflator for 1995 is just 100. Now, why is it just 100? Why did we not have to calculate it? That is because GDP deflator is equal to 100 in the base year. Right? In the base year, it's always 100 because we know in the base year, real and nominal GDP are the same, right? So when the numerator and denominator become the same in the base year, then the GDP deflator just becomes 100 over here. Base year, as in base year, real GDP, as in base year, real GDP is equal to nominal GDP. So if you are finding in the base year the GDP deflator, so that's very simple. It's just 100, right? Because these both are the same, right? So nominal GDP is the same as real GDP. So then that means that the GDP deflator just becomes 100. So let's find GDP deflator 1996. So 1995 is very simple. We didn't have to do any calculations as that was the base year, but now we will have to calculate it for 1996, right? So let's find GDP deflator for 1996. Now, GDP deflator for 1996 is going to be the nominal GDP in 1996 divided by the real GDP in 1996, and this is stuff we already calculated in part one. Real GDP for 1996 into 100. And we know that this real GDP that we're calculating, remember, whenever you're calculating real GDP, you need to look at what the base year is because real GDP is calculated using constant base year prices, right? So here base year is using base year 1995, right? So, so now we already found this in part one. The nominal GDP for 1996 is 6,610, and real GDP for 1996 was 5,450. This is already done in part one, right? So then this turns out to be 121.28. And here notice that when we're finding the GDP deflator, I'm not attaching any units to it because this is a price index. It doesn't have any units, right? So 1995, we said it's 100. In 1996, we said it is 121.28. You have no units attached to it. Another key thing to remember over here is, so the important thing to note over here is, from here is that the value of real GDP and thus GDP deflator. So the value of real GDP and thus GDP deflator, this should be kept in mind, and thus GDP deflator depends upon which base year we're looking at, right? Depends on which base year is considered, right? Depends on obviously, if you change the choice of base year, your values will change. Depends on which base year is considered. Because we know real GDP is calculated using base year prices, and GDP deflator depends upon real GDP. So both the value of the value of real GDP and thus GDP deflator depends upon your choice of the base year. So now let's just calculate the inflation rate also, since we've already found the GDP deflator. So now part B talks about for inflation rate. Now here let's recall what inflation rate is. We know inflation is an increase in the general price level in an economy, and the rate of inflation. So now let's recall that the rate of inflation, right? Inflation itself is the increase in the price level, but when we're calculating the rate of inflation, it equals the percentage change in a price index, right? And in this case, the price index, we're using GDP deflator. We could use another price index like CPI as well, but here we're looking at the GDP deflator equals the percentage change in a price index. In this case, we're working with the GDP deflator. In this case, the GDP deflator could have in the CPI too, the GDP deflator, the GDP deflator, right? So the formula for so inflation in year T is just going to be the price index in year T minus the price index in year T minus 1 divided by the price index in T minus 1 into 100, right? So just keep this in mind when you're calculating the inflation rate in any year T, right? Inflation rate in any year T, inflation rate in any year T is annual percentage change in price level from the previous year. So this is just something to keep in mind. This is how we calculate the inflation rate, right? So if I want to find the inflation rate in 1996, I want to find the annual percentage in the price level from the previous year, 1995. So it would be, so let's just find that now. So using, so let's just erase this all up. And now again, the choice of base year matters. So that will influence the real GDP and that will influence the GDP deflator. So using 1995 as a base year, we have inflation rate in 1996, like we said, will be price level in 1996. So in this case, the price level is measured using the GDP deflator. Another alternative way could be the CPI. The GDP deflator in 1996 minus the GDP deflator in the previous year, which is 1995. Okay, I got it right. How to multiply by 100 here, but we know we're going to multiply by 100. GDP deflator in 1995. And you multiply this entire thing with 100. Right, sorry, this became a little messy. Inflation rate in 1996, so this is stuff that we just calculated right now. The GDP deflator in 1996 was 121.28, and the GDP deflator in 1995 being the base year was 100. So this is also 100, and this is also 100. So then this just becomes 21.28%. So this is the inflation rate in 1996, measured as the annual percentage change in the price level from the previous year, 1995. So this is how we can calculate the inflation rate.